So Ross, not surprisingly, we've got a lot of questions about tax reform. Roslyn says, "Hi Ross, there seems to be many economists like you stating we need an overhaul of our tax system. Please tell us how the tax system should be changed."
Well, for a start, I'm not an economist. I'm a journalist. I write about economics, but I'm not an economist. And I am not one of the people who believe that the one big reform we really need that will fix everything is major tax reform. I don't believe that. That's a delusion. I do believe that there are, as with every system, there are bits that need fixing. And we do need to have some important changes. The changes we need are about taxing capital more heavily than we do at present. That means we need to reduce the discount on the capital gains tax, and we also need to deal with negative gearing. We've trembled about this. It's been on and off for years. We ought to do something about it. It's not a magic answer, but if we really do care about the next generation being able to afford houses, then that's part of what we need to do. The other thing is it's good to tax bad things, because taxes discourage activity. It's a good idea if you can tax a bad thing rather than tax a good thing. And when people go to work and earn money, that's a good thing. But when people are generating pollution, for example, or pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that's a bad thing. We had a tax on carbon. Tony Abbott abolished it. He shouldn't have. We'd be in much better shape if he hadn't, but that's one of the things that we've got to tax. He also got rid of the mining tax. The mining tax wasn't particularly good, but we do need to ensure that the mainly foreign companies who come to our country and take our resources and sell them overseas pay us a fair price for the resources, the iron ore and the coal that they get, and the petroleum, the gas they pull out of wells off the coast. They are not adequately taxed at the moment. We ought to tax that.
Phil asks, why not just outlaw tax deductions? Issues such as negative gearing and transfer pricing would simply disappear.
Well, it would certainly be simpler if we did outlaw tax deductions. Now, you couldn't do that for a company, because a company, gets sales in, but it has all these expenses, and the difference is the profit. And so you do have to have, companies do have to have deductions. You say, well, okay, just people with earning a wage, why do they need to have deductions? Well, that's not a bad argument. It would certainly make the tax system a lot simpler. But you could probably argue, and the thing is that Phil is right in thinking that tax deductions provide people with lots of scope to play games and basically tell the government that their deductions are greater than they really were. That's all true. But you can also say that some taxpayers have more expenses, income-related expenses than others, and they should be allowed for that.
Malcolm asks, in your opinion, what would be the benefits and drawbacks of the Australian government introducing a Buffett-style tax on those earning very high incomes, for example, over $1 million? Would there be any significant macroeconomic impact from this type of tax? And would you support the introduction of this type of tax?
It's an idea that appeals to me, the millionaire's tax, the tax that's out there. If you're not a millionaire, you don't pay it. The millionaires do pay it. That sounds really good. Unfortunately, what's wrong with it, or why it wouldn't, I don't believe it would do any harm. The millionaires would tell you it would destroy the economy. Don't believe it. What is true is that the millionaires would pay some smart accountant to find a way around the tax. That's true, and that's the reason why it's a good idea. It's probably not terribly practical.
And the last question on tax, David asks, why are income and profit taxed so heavily and capital hardly at all? Is it time to put the case for an estate tax similar to the UK's, perhaps in the name of a more equal society?
Yes, this is good, and it is right. We ought to be taxing wealth, not just income, because there's actually much more disparity, a much bigger gap between the people who've got lots of assets than the people who just get a high wage. Much more. So yes, we ought to be taxing that, and the idea that we should basically tax estates inheritance is a really good one, because it is rich families passing on their riches to the next generation that perpetuates and can make worse the gap between the top and the bottom. So it's a good idea. The problem with it is, if you tried it, people would immediately say it's a death duties, and the Australian public, perhaps not the youngest people in the Australian public, but all the old ones, they, oh no, death duty, no, we got rid of that years ago. And the truth is that an estate tax wouldn't raise all that much money, because you really only put it on to people who are really rolling in it. But it would make so it wouldn't raise a lot of money, but it would make the system fairer. And I would be happy to see it, but that would be very hard politically, because so many people think that death taxes are death.
Now, Ross, Paul says you've undoubtedly had a very significant influence on tens of thousands of high school economics students and teachers over decades with your writings, publications, and lecture series. But did you ever see yourself as an economics teacher in a school or a lecturer in economics at university?
I've never seen myself as a lecturer at university, because I don't think I know enough economic theory to pull that off. But I've often thought, if for some reason they throw me out of journalism, then I think I probably would become a high school economics teacher. Yes, I would.
Peg asks, why is the NDIS not means tested? Everything else is. For example, the pension, aged care. No wonder the NDIS budget is under strain.
Well, that's true. We do have a welfare system that's mainly means tested. In other words, if you're rich, you don't get it. And we make you disclose your details to see whether you get it, or we're going to give you a bit of it, etc. That's true. The exception to that is Medicare. Medicare is welfare. It's a benefit, and it's universal, and that has its advantages. Universal has its advantages and means tested. We haven't put a big means test on the NDIS, and it may be that some kind of means testing would help, but it's also but the problems that we've got. See, we never had one of these things before, and we didn't know what to expect, and it hasn't worked as well as we hoped, and that we have to do a lot of thinking to say, how did we get it so wrong? Why is it so expensive? What's happening? I think part of the thing is that the scheme involves getting people from the paying people from the private sector to do things for disabled people need doing. That sounds nice, but sometimes when people are doing something for the government, they think, you couldn't afford to pay me this, but the government's got all this money, so I'll just whack it up. And there's a fair bit of that going on. So there are a lot of problems that we need to sort out with that. But it is one of the big reforms that we've had, which is to say disability is not something where we leave the person's family on their own to look after it. I don't think means testing could be part of it, but I don't think it's a big part of making the system work properly and not cost an arm and a leg.
John asks, how do we fix the growing gap and inequality that is happening between the rich and the poor? We don't want to become a society where it matters more who your parents are or what school you attended, as opposed to working hard at school or equal opportunity. How do we fix that for our future generations?
Having taxes, better taxes on wealth and on capital gains. At the moment, we have a 50% discount on the capital gains tax. There should be some discount, but that's about twice as much as there should be. So that's part of it. Having a proper wealth tax, we could do. Having a stronger land tax is something we could do. Taxing the capital would help enormously. And the other thing is, as I've said often, you tax bad things, not good things, or to the extent that you can. So when people pollute, when people emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, greenhouse gases add to global warming, that's a perfect thing to tax. And when people says, I'm not paying the tax, I'm not going to have as many emissions, you've achieved something. That's because the tax has discouraged people from doing stuff you don't want them to do. That's a nice idea.
And on the topic of inflation, Bill says, I've always wondered why the target inflation rate for the Reserve Bank is set at 2 to 3%. Why isn't it set at 0%?
Short answer is because the CPI, the way we measure inflation, understates the degree of inflation because of measurement problems. All economists know that. It's not something they talk about, but we all know it. And so if you had a rule that said we have no inflation, you would actually be saying we must force prices to fall a bit every year, which isn't a good idea. So that's the main reason why we start at 2%, not 0. The other reason is a bit of inflation is it's kind of like oil that makes the system sort of move around. A bit of inflation lubricates the system and allows you to fix problems without causing too much trouble. That's the other reason.
And Ross, you've been at the Herald for 50 years. Gabriel asks, who has been our best Prime Minister in those 50 years and why?
I would have to say Bob Hawke. Why? Because he's a very smart man, but also he had the good fortune to have a cabinet that was very smart. And I've had plenty of Canberra public servants say to me, those guys are unbelievably smart, and even though everyone's better educated these days than they were then today's cabinet isn't as smart as those guys. And the thing that Bob Hawke did was he made himself chairman of the board. He let all those smart guys go out and do what cabinet had agreed needed to be done. He wouldn't come in over the top, and he'd only come in over the top if you had clearly stuffed it up. Now when you've got good people, that's a great way to manage them, and that's what he did, and it worked very well.
Mike asks, do we need a central bank?
Well, I happen to know Mike, and I'm not surprised he asked that question, because I think his answer to the question is no, we don't need a central bank. But I can't remember why he thinks we don't. And since he actually knows more about central banks than I do, I'm a bit tricky. I'm a bit wary. But what I would say is this. I don't think we need to have the central bank as the part of the government that's in the main control over how we run the economy from day to day. Because the advantage of having the Reserve Bank do that is that they are independent of the government. They don't worry that there's an election coming up. They ignore that. whereas a politician never would. But the other thing is that the only instrument they've got is interest rates. They can put them up. When they want to slow things down, they put them, as now, they put them up. When they want to speed things up, they put them down. Now that is not a fair way to do it, because it means that it hits home buyers much harder than everybody else, and it's just by chance that renters are also having a tough time now, not at other times. So that just using interest rates as the only way you try to speed the economy up or slow it down is not fair, especially when you're slowing it down, because it means that the people with big home loans bear a lot more trouble. If I own my own home, it hardly affects me. I'm looking fine. I'm not have a big problem with the cost of living. So there are other ways that we could slow the economy down or speed it up than just doing interest rates only. That, I think, needs to be changed, and the way you change it is to have an outfit that has other instruments that can play with the general rate of level of taxation, put it up temporarily, put it down temporarily. That'll be one thing. Or you could even play around with compulsory super contributions. When they're normal, they're 11% or whatever it is, and we could, for a period, we could put that up. Now that would force people to save more, and that would make it harder for them to spend, which is the object. The beauty of that is they'd still have that money. So you divide all the money that people in this had in super into the normal bit and the special bit, which sometimes we increased because we needed you to spend less, and other times we decreased because we needed you to spend more. But all that money would always stay with you. It's just that we might not let you spend it. It's still yours, and one day you'll get it all. So that's actually, to me, that seems a very appealing way of doing it.
And on the topic of rent, Patsy writes, one thing I'd like to raise. Economists, journalists and other people talk about rent going up, as though this was some sort of inexorable, magical process. Why don't people say landlords are raising rents? Why do we just accept that raising rents is okay? Many landlords are obviously raising rents because they can. I know interest rates have gone up, but rents have gone up much more. So some landlords are just price gouging. Nobody seems to criticise them for this.
Well, I think this is a question that you have stronger opinions on than I do, but I'll answer. I think that there is a point. Now, the thing is that there are some people who live off their rents, and if the general level of inflation goes up, and my cost of living, I'm a little old lady who owns a house that I rent out, then I'm affected by the cost of living, and I have to put my prices up the way everybody else does. That's one part of the response. But the other thing is, it's true that when there is a shortage of rental accommodation, I can put my prices up. Whether I need to put them up or I don't, whether you can afford to pay them or you can't, I can get away with putting them up simply because if you don't like it, where are you going to go? Well, there's not many other places you can go. Now, Patsy is right to say, how come we don't make this clearer? And it's true, economists don't. Because economists think, oh, isn't this great? The price is rising to bring demand and supply together. Isn't that lovely? Well, it's not lovely if you're the person who can't afford higher rates rent but is being charged it. And when you're not certain that the person who put the prices up needs to. We ought to say that more, but we don't, because we have this attitude that says if business or landlords do what comes naturally, that's fair enough. It's not necessarily fair enough.
Martin asks, why can't we refer to the party not in power as the alternative government rather than the opposition? The current name invites petty point scoring and a combative approach, while alternative government might inspire policy suggestions. Names matter.
Well, names do matter, but names can't change the universe. I think it's not a bad idea. And it is part of something of which we're proud. And that is that the opposition party, the alternative party of government, has just as much legitimacy as the other guys who won. That is one of the principles of parliamentary democracy. It's something that we should be proud of. It's good. We don't want to live in a one-party state. But and so the idea of saying, well, they're calling them the alternative government's nice, but it wouldn't change the fact that the alternative government wants to win the next election, and one of the easiest ways to win the next election is to say how bad the present government is and to do all in your power to trip them up. Now, we wish that our politicians were a bit more public-spirited than that, but these days they're more like that than they used to be.
Gregory says single professional mothers who have to earn more to survive are being hit hard compared with couples with two salaries. Why doesn't the Labor Party consider this, especially Albanese, as the child of a single parent?
Well, that's a good question, but it's not just professional mothers, i.e. mothers who work in a profession. It's all single parents, and some of them are men, a few of them are men, who've got young kids to look after. That makes it very hard for them to earn, to have a normal job. And yes, they should get a better deal. Not because other couples are able to bring in two incomes, but because it's very hard. It's very, very hard for single parents to live decently because they've got to spend so much of their time looking after their kids. And we ought to be much more sympathetic. And we went into this thing that said, well, if you got these kids and reach a certain age, then we're not going to count them. It's having the kids to look after without having another partner that is tough on anybody. And we ought to be giving those people a better deal than we do.
Larry writes, a lot has been made of bracket creep in the discussions on Stage 3 tax cuts, and you mention it in your articles. As I understand it, wage increases over the last decade or more have been at an all-time low. So I would have thought bracket creep, which only sees a taxpayer paying the higher rate on the amount that falls within the higher bracket in any case, would not be such an issue. Where am I incorrect on this?
Well, because things have changed. What Larry says is true. It is true that wages have not been growing strongly, and we went through a protracted period where prices didn't rise by much and wages didn't rise by much. Inflation was surprisingly low. That's true, and that actually doesn't mean that you don't have bracket creep, but it means you don't have much, and that was true. And all of that changed when suddenly all the prices started shooting up. And we're used to saying, well, if the prices have gone up by 5%, everyone should get a 5% pay rise. What's happened is that prices went up by about 8% and wages went up a lot, even though they not by as much as the 8%. And what that means is that the problem with bracket creep is that taxes get pushed up by inflation. Now, inflation is a cost to you. It doesn't benefit you. And even if you can have a situation where prices rose by 5%, my pay rose by 5%, the tax system doesn't know that you're no better off. And it says, you've got an extra 5%, so we're going to make you more tax. That's bracket creep. And you don't literally always have to move to a higher bracket before you're affected by what is called bracket creep. So bracket creep is an issue. I'm not saying it's the worst thing in the world, but we ought to handle it better than we have been, and we certainly ought to fix or ease the problem better than the way that the stage 3 tax cuts originally wanted to do, which was, I'll fix the problem, I'll get a situation where in the future bracket creep won't be as great, but to get to there, all the tax cuts are going to, pretty much all the tax cuts are going to go to the top half, and the bottom half's going to get nothing. That's one of the things that was wrong.
And Ken asks, should the Australian Tax Office become an independent body like the Reserve Bank, thus setting tax rates and thresholds for different brackets without the involvement of politicians? What would be the pros and the cons?
Well, the decision that we made back in the 90s to give the Reserve Bank independence, until the 90s, early 90s, the government decided when interest rates went up, and the government was always saying, well, we better put them up probably, but there's an election on, so we won't put them up now, we'll put them up later. Or they're high and there's an election coming, and so maybe we better cut them a bit. So the management of our economy improved enormously when we took this very important instrument for moving the economy up and down and gave it to the Reserve Bank and said, you can decide what to do. You tell, once you've decided what you're doing, you tell the Treasurer, but you don't have to get permission, you decide. That's worked very well. But we live in a democracy. In the end, we have to be able to vote for the people who are running the economy, because if they stuff it up, we need to be able to say, bugger you, you're out. We'll try the other lot. Now, the more things you hand over to the bureaucrats, the less ability the voter has to say, no, I don't like it. And we still have a situation where if the Reserve Bank stuffs up, guess who gets the blame? The government, even though the Reserve Bank was independent. So you've got to be careful about how much you make independent of the people who answer to us, which is the police.
And Paul says, I'm wondering if we could all do with a change in our attitudes to tax. I've decided that I like paying tax, which puts me at odds with almost every other person I know, but I feel gives me a greater appreciation of all the services and good fortune we have in Australia. I like to think of it a bit like being a shareholder, where I pay my tax and get a return on investment via services and a healthy society. And the best bit is that my shares count for no more or less than any other shareholder, where we all get to have our equal say at the ballot box. Interested to know if you feel a more positive mindset about the tax we pay would be generally helpful, and if so, how this might be achieved.
Well, I think Paul's really onto something there, and I've got news for Paul. He's the only person who believes it, except me. I do too. And I hope that sort of comes through in what I write. I don't think taxes are bad, I think taxes are good. Now, taxes can be organised in a way that's unfair, taxes can be spent in ways that aren't sensible, but taxes are a good thing. Taxes pay for all the benefits that we get from the government, including building roads and taking our garbage and everything. So it is a good thing, and if we want more and better services, and every single one of us does, then the idea that taxes should go up so that we can have more government services, or so that the quality of the government services isn't as bad as it's become, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And I do not encourage people to just regard tax as a great evil. It's not. It's a good thing. And the more of us thought that it was a good thing, accepted that it's a good thing, we'd actually get better policy, because it's unthinking people who say, oh, the other side's going to put up taxes, oh, I won't vote for that. That's the way you get bad taxes.
Ross, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.